Welcome to the Heroes of Cosplay Sanctuary Friends. Here we are in season 4 and the start of a new season. I have a very special guest for you. As a member of the 501st Legion, you may have seen him at conventions like DragonCon, and his extensive works extend far beyond the world of cosplay, having published his works in Armchair General Magazine, Clarkesworld Magazine, Gizmodo, Slate, The Verge, and others. His short fiction appears in the Galaxy Edge magazine, Curious Fictions. He's a master storyteller and understands cosplay from a unique perspective with his research in history, technology, and science fiction. Here to talk about his new book, Cosplay: A History, the builders, fans, and makers who bring your favorite stories to life. Please welcome to the show the very accomplished historian, journalist, cosplayer, and author, Andrew Liptak, to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. You got the entire title in.
Well, I know, and the book first of all, and I want to talk about the book right away. Of course, I like to go through just a little bit about the guests, a little bit about Andrew first, but just an amazing book, amazing work. I'll probably say it many times as we're talking, but first and foremost, your origins in cosplay in the 501st Legion, which of course we've had a member of the 501st on the show previously. And the group itself dedicated to promoting Star Wars through the building of quality costumes. That's their words, not mine. And they're instrumental in just many events and many things that go on all over, the United States and everywhere else. It's a very large group, a very, very amazing organization, and they also help cosplayers to gain access with building costumes and different pieces that originated from the Star Wars universe. Would love to hear about just how you got into cosplay and how you got into the 501st.
My interest in costuming and my love of Star Wars sort of came from the same place. So it's actually 25 years ago this year, the Star Wars special editions came out, and my dad took me. And I very distinctly remember coming out of the theater and thinking that the stormtroopers looked very, very cool. Just something about the armor just sort of stuck in my mind. And I really distinctly remember driving home or riding home, just sort of imagining like what, sort of adventures they got off to, ignoring for the fact that they're, the evil empire and, the bad guys of the universe. It's just, they had cool uniforms. That was in mid-high school, middle school, somewhere in there. And sort of for the next couple of years, I was sort of trying to figure out how do I make like my own sort of Star Wars costume. And over the years, I did end up making my own costumes, or had, my parents sort of made stuff for me. You play with a lightsaber with a dowel of wood, or I think for Halloween, I dressed up as Luke Skywalker one year. But like I went to like shop class. I sort of was trying to figure out, like, we were making metal toolboxes. So I was like, can I do a stormtrooper armor? And pretty quickly realized, like, no, that's too complicated for like the level of stuff we were doing. It's doable, but not a high school shop class, at least at the level we were at. I was in my high school's band, and for 6 years I bugged our music director, Chris Rivers, to say, like, to let us play music from Star Wars. And after
the Imperial March was always something that I'd hoped that we'd be able to do in our band. But
that was one of them. He ended up getting an arrangement of several of the big themes. So it was the opening theme, Imperial March. I want to say the Battle of the Forest from Return of the Jedi, Princess Leia's theme. Maybe one other, Yoda's theme, maybe. And so, my senior year, my last concert, he basically said, all right, we're going to do Star Wars, just to get Andrew to stop, pestering us about it. And I had known about the 501st at that point. I subscribed to Star Wars Insider magazine, and they had run some features about the group over the years, because it had just started getting going. I think this is, by this point, it was 2003.
Yeah, that was really popular. I remember that magazine for sure.
Oh, it's still around too, and they do cover the 501st still. And so I had seen them. I knew that they existed, and I sort of figured out that there was a group nearby, the New England Garrison. And I, with my teacher's permission, I emailed them, said like, "Hey, can we invite stormtroopers, and he agreed. And so we basically reached out to him, had a little bit back and forth, and one of them showed up. He drove all the way up from Rhode Island, the guy named Scott Allen, and blew me away because real life stormtrooper right here. We started, we all assembled on stage. We played music. He came in right on cue during Imperial March. The crowd went nuts. How do I do this for myself? And he's like, well, here's, you email me a certain amount of money. I think it was about $500. I had a summer job that summer, so I saved up my money, sent it off to him, and by the end of the summer I got my own suit of stormtrooper armor.
Wow.
And that's where I started getting into this. At that point it was a pretty easy thing to put together. It came with Velcro, and I just I slapped it together, and I sort of brought it out every now and then. At my job, I worked at a summer camp for a couple of years, so for various events, you can use it anytime there. Halloween, I'd bring it out every now and then. I worked at a bookstore. I think I wore it 1 year for that. And then, at college, I sort of wore it every now and then. I wasn't really involved in the Final First until 2005, when Celebration came about, which was the big Celebration 3. This is the big Star Wars convention. That's when I met other members of the 501st, more members of the 501st, and really got into this is a big group, and they're these are people I can sort of hang out with eventually. And then when I graduated college, I had a car and free time on my hand, and ended up driving all over the place around New England to start going to troops. So local parades, we had various Star Wars events that were around at that point, like toy opening, like toy releases, game releases. So I don't know what the next convention I went to was. Some convention, probably Boston Comic Con or something, or Granite State Comic Con in New Hampshire. And just sort of fell into the 501st from there. It was a very supportive group. They helped me, hook me up with pieces of the armor that I was missing. For the first couple of years, I was missing the shoes, so I ended up getting a new set of those. Yeah, I just sort of rose to the ranks there. I was the executive officer for a little while. Well, one of my friends was the commanding officer of the New England Garrison. I helped set up some things, and just sort of tried to give back where I could. And then eventually was able to start getting more troopers up here in Vermont. At that time, I was one of 2 or 3 troopers living up here. So I recruited a friend from college, just another guy up in northern Vermont that had a sort of erratic work schedule and couldn't always make it out to stuff. We would get in the car early in the morning, drive down to an event, and then come back late in the evening. And that that was sort of the schedule for a couple of years. And then slowly we just started getting more people who were interested, or people started coming out of the woodwork, especially around the Force Awakens release, or the year or so before, as more people started getting interested in the film.
Wow.
And because the franchise was coming back.
Yeah, you built everything from kind of the ground, like one of the first.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, there was some folks here, but I basically got tired of having to drive down to events, and it was like, come on, guys, you got to come up here. And it's a long drive, so it was a little it's like, all right, well, if I can't get people reliably up here for events, I'll just try to find more people up here to do them. There's a local Vermont convention for a couple of years that we set up a table for. We ended up taking, this is I want to say the year before The Force Awakens, so probably 2014. We got about 30 names on people put their names down on a list. And about 10 or 15 of them came through and said, yeah, I want to be a stormtrooper. So we ended up doing group buy, a batch. We bought 10 suits of armor all at once and got a discounted rate, and then basically set up a program of, hey, all right, this weekend we're going to work on the shoulders or the upper arms or forearms of the chest, and just sort of go through it step by step and hold people's hand along the way, just to help them figure out, it's daunting. You spend several $100s on a suit of armor. It comes in a box of plastic. You have to start, you start to cut it, and it's like, oh, I don't know. You worry about, making a mistake right away.
I worry, I spent all this money, and now I'm like, okay, now I'm going to have to destroy it a little bit. This could, if this goes south, it's going to get expensive, but yes.
Yep. I mean, yeah. And so we basically tried to just mentor people as best we could. There's nothing you can do to this that you can't fix later. Here's how to do it step by step. And we did a couple days where we got together as a group, and I think the last thing we all had to do was a helmet. So we basically got together in a big room and did a helmet build, and just banged them all out. Over the years, I've steadily added to the suits that I've made. So I started with a stormtrooper. The next one I built was an Attack of the Clones era clone, which I built in my apartment's living room, much to the dismay of my landlord. And then when my wife and I moved into a house 10 years ago, it had a big workshop. So I was like, oh, great, I can build all sorts of other things down here. So I ended up getting, I made a shore trooper from Rogue One, First Order trooper from The Force Awakens. And then I've got a 212th Airborne in clothes, one of the Beehive orange and white guys, boxes of and kits down in the basement that I just haven't gotten to. We've got a couple helmets that I'm working on right now. Some other random things. So there's like an endless stream of projects that I have now.
Andrew could have easily written a book about cosplay, and he wrote a book about cosplay, but from a historical perspective, not about all of the builds and everything that you've done for so many years. Which you're an encyclopedia of knowledge on how to make the costumes, but also just a ton of work and thought that went into your new book. It's so amazing. It's just an amazing story, first of all, to hear about how you went from there to now.
I'll caution you in saying that I'm an encyclopedia of knowledge. I know very little about a lot of these things. I've built a bunch of things, but there are people who are far more knowledgeable about things like 3D printing and foam work and everything else that goes into it. I would describe myself as a competent amateur. I've just been in sort of the right place to build a lot of this stuff over the years. And that's also probably a little bit why this is not a how-to book, because I'm not really an expert there. But my background is in history. I got my bachelor's in history, and then I went on to get my master's in military history. So I've always been interested in sort of where I've written about how to build stuff. I wrote a series on IO9 about how I built a stormtrooper, and sort of went piece by piece. But it's more. I've always been a little bit more interested in just like, how did this thing come about? Like, how do we get to the point where we are dressing up in costume at a convention? Because that's not every time I suit up, it's like, this is a really ridiculous thing I'm doing. I enjoy it, but it's still it's still pretty ridiculous sometimes.
The book is not thin. Okay, it's 350 pages but it is a fast read, and there are many books that I can say that I can just get through as fast as I did with this. So it really is well written. It's very relatable writing, and it does keep you turning pages. So I really applaud how you put everything together, and just like what you decided to include. I guess one thing that I've been really curious about is your process for research, because there are hundreds of cited. It's very well documented.
There are a lot of footnotes,
and there are a lot of footnotes. It's hundreds of footnotes. Would you mind just taking us through a little bit of your research process?
So part of this draws on my own experience. In the 501st, I sort of talk about my own entry into it as a starting point, and then sort of branch out from there. And so I wrote about the 501st Legion and some of the stuff for when I worked for IO9, and then over the years I've gotten to interview folks about costuming. People like Adam Savage, of Mythbusters. I interviewed him a bunch of times about making and costuming and things like that. Ann Foley, who's a costume designer who worked on the show Altered Carbon on Netflix, and talked about that sort of things with there. So I got interested in writing about like the process and how it is, how and why we make things, and why we costume as things, and how Hollywood costumes are sort of coming together. I also read a book called The One Device by Brian Merchant, which is a history of the iPhone. It's a fascinating book. It's not a book where it's like this thing happened and then this thing happened and this thing happened. He sort of breaks the book into various components, like what's the history of cameras, and how did Apple go about putting a camera into a phone? How did it build a touchscreen, and like where does it get all the minerals required for the batteries or the frames, so forth. and all the way up to like, what is the impact of the sudden expansion of smartphones on America's cellular networks. And so that book really got me interested in how does, what are all the individual components of cosplay? What's the social impact? And like, what's the story behind the story? So when it came time to write the book, and actually this book was originally designed to be a history of the 501st Legion, didn't quite. That was the first iteration when Joe Monti, my original editor, sort of pitched it to me. It was like, is there a story here about this group? And we thought about it, and yeah, we can do sort of a blow by blow of how the group came about. But as I did that, there were some roadblocks along the way that meant that the book didn't come about as we envisioned. But that was actually sort of a good thing, because as I was putting the book together, I realized in order to sort of understand the history of the 501st, you need to understand how do we come to costume outside of a professional setting, like as cosplayers, and how far back does it go? So I had written quite a bit about science fiction history and knew that there was conventions and masquerades, but I wanted to sort of connect all these various things together that were sort of floating around. So like the history of the technologies involved, from 3D printing, that's sort of my tech background coming out. My background in writing about science fiction history came out about because this is a story about fandom. And then like looking at like, what does this mean for what does this mean for entertainment as a much broader story? Because what cosplay really is, it's about fans dressing up as their favorite characters and relating to those stories. And if you look at box office numbers and like sort of social penetration, everybody talks about Marvel, everybody talks about Game of Thrones, everybody talks about, well, a lot of people talk about all these different franchises. So all those things sort of come together into this one, mess of a world where, when you're dressing up as a stormtrooper, you're sort of like, we're relating to that franchise in a certain way. And so I was interested in all of that. That's sort of the long and convoluted answer for how my process was. I wanted to sort of incorporate all of it together in some way. So some of it was looking back through old newspapers and finding like, all right, where are there instances of Mr. Skygack, which is this cartoon from the early 1900s. I went to a site called Fanac, which was basically this fan created archive of world science fiction, like science fiction fandom. And they have documents that include like the pre-convention updates from the con committees, like talking about like, all right, here's where this con's going to be. This is what we're going to have. You need to send in your money. This is what we are hoping to hear. This is who's going to be here. And they started talking a little bit about costuming, over the years. You sort of, as you read these documents in sequence, you sort of see this movement come about. So the first World Science Fiction Convention was in 1939.
Wow.
And a guy named Forrest Ackerman dresses up along with his girlfriend, makes him a costume, Morosia. She makes him the costume from an H.G. Wells film. They show up. Everyone's like, what the hell are you doing? This is very strange. And he's like, well, I'm this character. And then the next year, several more people showed up in costume, thinking that was kind of a cool idea. And then the year after that. And then if you look at the documents of these, that come out after this, they think, people are like, all right, let's have a costume masquerade and a party. And you see this thing sort of develop over the years. So part of that process was going through those documents and seeing like, how did this change over time? And then interviews. I interviewed a lot of people, from some folks who were from, those early years of fandom. And they provided me with some interesting memories and some things that really changed how I thought about some of this stuff. Those folks provided me with pictures. I talked to people like Adam Savage, Amy Dansby, who was on the first season of Lego Masters, who I met at DragonCon a couple years ago, and she does all this really incredible 3D printing stuff. I interviewed stormtroopers. I interviewed Albin Johnson, who founded the 501st. Steve Sansweet, who is the head of fan relations at Lucasfilm. All sorts of people from all over the place. I interviewed folks who worked in living history, because one of the things I include in here is living history museums and reenacting, because as I was writing, I sort of realized that it's sort of under the same umbrella of people dressing up to relate to a story, whether or not it's fictional or real. So I wanted to sort of include that little bit in there. So yeah, it's just, there's a whole lot of stuff that sort of came together, and yeah, lots of interviews, lots of traveling out to conventions to take pictures of folks, and yeah.
Yes, just a lot of interesting stories and characterizations. There's one story that I do in particular want to mention, but really just great references to Yaya Han and Allison Tabitha in the book. But one very interesting story in particular about a reenactment that actually drew Napoleon Bonaparte to the event. And just the things that were going on with masquerades at the time, and that some of these events kind of snowballed. They were not intended to be quite as large in reenactments as they became. And I think there was one instance where they weren't sure if it was going to really draw a crowd, and there ended up just being just a ton of people that showed up, and it ended up raining at the event. They got rained out.
Yeah, that was the Eglinton tournament, 1839, in Scotland, and that was something I had started to. I knew I wanted to talk about reenacting, so I was sort of following that thread back of, all right, I knew that reenacting had sort of become a thing in the mid 20th century, but like were some of the precursors? And as I was sort of doing some research online, I came across references to it, and I came across this really phenomenal image that somebody James Henry Nixon painted the same year, and it's this phenomenal painting of this battle that's taking place. It's knights on armor, riding on horses, fighting each other, and I sort of realized, like, oh wow, this is exactly like an 1800s version of cosplay, because this is not how soldiers dressed at that time. So it was a really interesting scene. And there's actually an entire book about it that some guy wrote. Where we have it here. It's called The Knight and the Umbrella, an account of the Eglinton tournament 1839. And it's this, wow. Yeah, it's a, I found it online, and it's this very dry, several hundred page book about every little in and out of this battle, this mock battle that they set up. And that's sort of what I was really interested in this, because the origins of this tournament was there's this lord who is just very disgruntled about the state of things in England, and was basically like, there's no pageantry, there's no traditions, we're forgetting our heritage as Englishmen. And so he basically went forward and, like, if we don't have this, I will go and, I'll bring it back myself. So he basically spent an enormous amount of money to set up this tournament, hired out all these suits of armor for these volunteers. They practiced a bit, and then, they all assemble up in Scotland. About 100,000 people show up, and then it rained, like torrential rain. And they were able to do, like, I guess it was raining so hard that, like, they couldn't. People in the stands could barely see the people in the field. Like that's how hard it was coming down. There's a fort here near me here in Vermont called Fort Ticonderoga, which was an instrumental point during the Revolutionary War. I'd been to it as a kid, and I've been to it a couple of times since, and that was another sort of instance of this sort of like living history type thing of like where, like, and I wanted to sort of dig into, like, how do people explore, like, put themselves in costume to sort of understand the history of these of our, the history that's right in front of them, and sort of trying to bring it back to life a little bit. And it was a really fascinating thing, because, like, what they're doing is they're trying to, when you put on armor, like medieval armor or Revolutionary War uniforms, constructed in the same way that they were constructed hundreds of years ago, you get a new perspective on that history, and you are able to sort of better understand what they might have gone through. Like, it might be one thing to say, like, oh, all these people on a march, like, if this, they couldn't have possibly, I don't see any reason why they couldn't have marched like 20 miles like this. But then when you throw it all on, it's like, oh, this is really heavy and it's hot and it's uncomfortable, and it gives you a whole new perspective on a battle. While I was in my work as a historian, I studied my university's history with World War II and World War I, and the school is a military academy called Norwich University. I studied the Norwich soldiers who fought in World War II at Gettysburg. The Battle of the Bulge and D-Day, and actually went out with the university personnel, board of directors and the president and whatnot. It was some sort of fundraising leadership type trip, and so that was a really fascinating visit for me. And there's elements of that in cosplay too. We, as the 501st Legion, we try to make our costumes as closely as possible to what's on the screen, and that gives us a little bit of perspective into like what it took to put into making Star Wars, because we're wearing armor that's pretty similar to what they were back in the 1970s and 1980s. The same thing with any of these older costumes that we're all fans of. It sort of gives you a little bit of insight, and it lets you touch that film world just a little bit.
Though all of the detail and work that you discuss, talking about what could be considered the DIY revolution, there's definitely a turning point, and I do appreciate that that you do recognize and acknowledge the way that the costumes were made in the older movies. One thing that I feel has just changed a lot is with all the computer graphics and animations that. Yes, there are costumes in the movies now, but sometimes they're just wearing a little green suit with a bunch of balls all over it. And that, I think, for us as just references, makes it really hard to recreate some of these things exactly. But that we still, a lot of cosplay, there's some just amazing cosplayers out there that pull it off. They create it from a CG reference. But really, just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the crafting and even the evolution of your own cosplays as time's gone. You've already mentioned a little bit that you've kind of they've evolved. That you started with certain pieces and you kind of upgraded as you go. And I think some of us do go through those iterations over time. But looking at kind of a longer perspective of your own cosplays and maybe how technology has made things a little bit more streamlined now than the way that they used to be.
My shore trooper from Rogue One. Actually, I've got pull out an example. This guy. Wow. This is one of my favorite ones, and one of the reasons for that is that costume involves. It's a lot different from the Stormtrooper. Just in the way that I've made it. The helmet is made of slush cast resin. So you put it in a mold and you slush around and then carve it all the details out, which I had used with my clone trooper. So I had some experience with it, but this was a little bit of a better helmet. The armor itself is all vacuum formed plastic. Ooh. And okay. That was made before the film came out. There was a, let's see, this was 2016. I think Rogue One came out. Yes. So earlier that summer, we had gotten a teaser trailer for the film, and we saw a blurry bit of the shore troopers, and some people were like, "Oh, those guys look kind of cool." So I set up a Facebook group, and there's a couple of Facebook groups popped up of these folks who were just interested in building this costume, and they started just sort of looking at whatever reference pictures they had, which at first was not very much. When Star Wars Celebration took place in London that year, they put 3 of those costumes up on display, and that allowed cosplayers to go and take pictures from every angle and really get a good look at what they looked like. And that allowed them to then start building and sculpting their own stuff. So this, I want to say that was probably July, so probably August, September. Folks had already prototyped that armor and had begun making versions. So I got my armor as an early version of one of from a guy named 850 Armor Works. And because it was a early costume that they had just reference pictures on, it wasn't very accurate because you're sort of working off of pictures rather than the actual dimensions or whatever. There is a sort of a best guess. It came pretty close, but there was still areas where it had to be improved a little bit here and there. And along the way, people had started modeling the armor with 3D software to the point where you can now go and download the armor in its entirety from a couple different places. And there's a couple versions of this. So for the parts that were inaccurate, I ended up getting a friend of mine to 3D print. And so like there's a part on the over the belly, the abs. I had to cut that piece out and just plunk this new 3D printed version in and glued it in, painted over it, and it it worked just fine. With the belt, people upgraded bits and pieces there. I ended up going for a guy named Paul Prentice, who designed some very accurate, very nicely cast resin versions. And I got a belt from there. So they added those to my belt, which replaced my janky, the janky one that I made myself. Those are some of the little upgrades that I made here and there for that costume. And it's interesting because it involves 3D printing, the ABS, the vacuum forming, which is much, what the first stormtroopers were made of, and then resin casting. So it's kind of a neat blend of all three traditions.
Wow.
There are there's others that have done that with various bits and pieces and components. I just got a wrecker helmet from the Bad Batch for my son my son Bram, because he likes the character, and I'm thinking for Halloween we'll try to do that as a character for him.
Oh, cool.
One of the guys I interviewed about the costuming midway in the book is a guy named Brian Anderson, who actually 3D printed me the parts. He had, for a couple of years, when the Clone Wars TV series first came out, he went and saw that and was like, oh, I really want to get a clone trooper, but nobody's making them, so I'll go ahead and do it. So he learned how to vacuum form himself and sculpt helmets. So he basically made all the bucks for all the pieces of the version 1 armor. Sort of adapted it to human form because they're a little bit not quite the same proportions, and sort of started churning out armor locally. When 3D printing became a thing, he sort of switched over to that. And one of the things he was telling me is that, if I needed to make a change to any of the armor while I was, done via the traditional way, I would have to go and resculpt the entire buck. And this, with 3D printing, all I have to do is just tweak the file and then push it out as an update to everybody, and they can then update that one part. And so it makes it really it distributes that accuracy quite well. And so I know
quality,
so I know that happened with the short trooper groups as well. As there were some early attempts in some early files that are not, they're really good, but they're not 100% accurate. I'm not a huge accuracy person, but some people are. And all he had to do is just update the files a little bit, and you can just swap out a piece and just print it up yourself. You don't have to manufacture it in one place. And I think that's one reason why we see the short troopers. You see them at conventions. They're still a pretty popular costume. A big part of that is because they look cool. But the other part is just that I think that there's a good community around them that is interested enough to continue to tweak the costume and to look at all the fine details. And so we saw them come back in the Mandalorian second season.
Yes. And
we're going to see them at least from what I've hopefully this won't spoil it too much for people. Cover your ears if you are spoiler averse, but they show back up in Andor according to some of the shots from the filming. So I have to think that there's some aspect of the fandom around them that leads them to continue to be used in some way to, and which I think is kind of a neat thing, is to have, fans sort of, studios or filmmakers sort of seeing, people really love these characters, so they will continue to use them. And I think that's why we see Batman fans, Spider-Man films coming up every couple of years, is, there's that fandom that supports those characters coming back.
New eyes and a new generation. So now it's more, bringing your kids through, and just like maybe it was in the 80s, or even 20 years ago when episode 1, 2, and 3 came out, that it was more generational. So you were introducing a new generation to all of the things that you love so much, or that just really became a part of your fandom. And you get to do it again and again, because yes, the popularity remains over the years. And of course, we did have to take a little bit of a break from cinema in 2020 with COVID, but it did honestly open up different sorts of possibilities. I probably wouldn't have a podcast now if we didn't have COVID. And there's just a lot going on online in general. I guess I just wanted to get your take on how things changed very rapidly in a very short amount of time, really just 2 years, and all these little big things that led to many little changes, I think, in the cosplay community. But do you think that overall, was there a net positive or negative for cosplay in general, with the new normal in effect, and that that cosplay or that COVID has had this effect on the community?
Cosplay is inherently a social thing. You look back through the history, and it's people trying to relate to their favorite characters, to sort of bring those characters to life for the people around them. And you go to, decades back through conventions, you see people doing, bringing in characters, or dressing up as characters because, the folks that are around them will like it. And they form communities around building costumes. So late 1960s, 1970s, you see folks who come up in the costume masquerade tradition start to form their own conventions and their own costume, their own convention tracks at like places like Worldcon for building costumes and sort of carving out a dedicated niche for themselves. Fast forward a couple decades, and you see sites like the Replica Props Forum or cosplay.com, or any of the variety of anime sites or live journal communities that spring up. And there's always been a sense of people wanting to connect with one another, and the internet supercharges that. Social media has gone even further with that. But like when I got started, the first 501st forums were, we had our website with our own forums on there. We used Yahoo groups at one point. There was the Replica Props forum that was sort of a good incubator for a lot of these costumers, and all these sites sort of worked as hubs for people to sort of not only meet one another, but also to exchange tips, to coordinate when are we going to go to this convention or that convention. Social media has just sort of expands that. So Facebook was a big thing when it introduced groups. I want to say we used to be our 501st forum was a lot more vibrant back before Facebook, because where you would share all your Star Wars, I found this cool picture, this cool meme, or this funny thing about Star Wars, that would go into our forums. Now that we're sharing them on our social feeds, and either in our groups or on our personal profiles. You see groups pop up like the Shore Trooper groups that are dedicated to that costume. And then you have like very visually oriented social networks like Flickr, and then Instagram and TikTok, which have are really great for customers because it's all about pictures. You can post your latest photo shoot or candids from a convention, or just your build process. And so all those things sort of we've sort of been accelerating those connections through all these different platforms. So that's been like the biggest constant, is this change. There's these new platforms that come out that sort of allow us to connect more and more and more. I wasn't really on Instagram before the book, but I've become a much more active user because I have been following a lot of cosplayers, and and I found folks that I write about for places now or for the book through it because of the connections that it forms. And the other thing that I think that is important here is that social, like Facebook, is one big bucket. You have within your own personal, within your own life, you have all these different niches. Like you've got your work friends, you've got your college friends, high school friends, cosplay friends. Facebook puts all that into one column and just shows you everything that you're posting. So you might post something about work, or you might post something about, something like, oh, I remember this trip that I took with my friends. And then like, hey, here's all my pictures from this convention. And so not only do your convention friends get to see it, but you can find more convention friends because Facebook might recommend them to you. Or your aunt who has no interest in cosplay will start seeing, that you're dressing up in costume, or your coworkers or your friends who are outside of those circles. And you start to see more of it. So it becomes more of it starts to spread beyond those circles that were once pretty confined to sort of strict genre spaces. And I think that's been ongoing as well. Like if you nowadays on Instagram, if you click on one cosplay picture and then you follow to another one, and it sort of drags you down this thread. So you get to see more and more of it. So that helps too. That accelerates that growth of those communities because it connects these people pretty rapidly. And that's good or bad. I mean, there's certainly downfalls in having communities become, very, very large. The 501st is certainly a big organization, but like, it's a bucket of everybody from all over the place. So, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, fandom in general is a very big umbrella, but there's all these little sub fandoms underneath it. And, you can have tension between Marvel fans or DC fans, or people who want to bring the Snyderverse back, or people who don't care. So you have also, you have all sorts of like, these sort of things come up there. So like social media can be good or bad because it can sort of exacerbate some of those issues. I know every now and then you'll see within the cosplay community will spring up like, people judging, oh, this cosplayer isn't accurate enough, or this person doesn't look like this character, or this person looks wrong for this character. And I think that can be harmful in the long run if the community is not ready to sort of deal with it in a good manner. And I mean, for the most part, I think people are really great about it. Like they're pretty good about calling out negativity and being very supportive, which is something I think that we need more of. With
the growth, I mean, really, cosplay has grown so much. I mean, it's had kind of a long runway. So, if we're going all the way back to the 1800s, you could argue that, maybe it hasn't grown as fast as we perceive it to today, but that over time.
Oh no, it's grown fast. It's grown really fast.
It's definitely accelerated.
It's one of those exponential curves.
Definitely acceleration, but definitely, there's been shifts for some ground rules inside of cosplay, I guess is where I'm steering this. The whole concept of cosplay is not consent, which and bullying and things like that come up. With your research, has this been something that, just with the growth of cosplay, especially with this exponential curve that we've been seeing, is it really something that we should look to address, and that, should be something that we now need to resolve as a much larger community and really hone in on and pay attention to?
Fandom has its own peculiar history with sort of like, how do you deal with folks who don't quite look like you, or who don't quite believe what you believe? In some places it's been a very male dominated space, and fandom, like these sorts of social structures tend to have momentum, and they tend to transfer a lot of those tendencies from one generation to the next. So bad behavior, my theory here is that some of the bad behaviors we see have their roots going decades back. So like the original, within like science fiction fandom, there's been a lot of sort of trying to find the best way to put it. Like people have been trying to, the field has been diversifying, and that is sort of a reaction against some of the tendencies that have, very exclusionary tendencies that have taken place within that field, within that social structure. So, and there's lots of reasons for why those things are coming up now. You have more people entering the field because you have it's easier to get into it through online. Barriers. There's fewer barriers. Within science fiction writing, all you need to do is basically have a blog or set up an Amazon account. You can start publishing your own books. So it's sort of upending some of those traditional power, some of those traditional hierarchies. When I started with the 501st, a lot of 501st members really refused to call themselves cosplayers, and some of them still do because they don't really see it as play. And I think that there's also sort of I don't want to say a bias, but there's sort of like assumptions made about like what cosplay is. I think there's more of an association with anime. And if you're just not an anime fan, you might not really want to, you might have certain opinions about it or certain connotations that you draw from it that are probably not accurate. But there's those tendencies sort of get drawn out over time. I think a lot of people who refuse to call themselves cosplayers years ago now don't care. They sort of realize that, all right, this is a big umbrella, and there's a better understanding of what cosplay is and what the term means. And so I think we're sort of making it up as we go along. And change does not happen overnight. There's some changes that should, but they don't. And I think a lot of it is just learning, trying to understand, how behaviors sort of persist over time and correcting it on a systematic level. Cons, I think, have really begun to come around and, actually enforce harassment policies. I think people are more willing to understand what cosplay is and not be kind of turned off by it. But, there's still people who aren't fans, which is fine. They don't have to be, but I think that, and one of the things I hope that the book does is sort of explain a little bit more about, what it is, and so that they understand a bit more. There's an interesting exchange I had a while back with some folks who run a local comics convention, and they, on their sign, they very proudly put like, only comics, no cosplay. And I was sort of grumbling about this to one of the people who was involved, and his reaction was sort of like, well, sort of the impression that it was just, women who were dressing up in very minimal clothes trying to get attention. And it's like, well, it's not really that. It's that, for one, they're suiting up as characters who are probably dressed like that, but it's not really, it doesn't diminish them as fans. And it's just an exchange that has stuck out in my head because it struck me as very close-minded. And I think that it's also just it's one of those impressions and habits and traditions that has sort of stretched back because, lots of comic authors or artists weren't fans of cosplayers for whatever reason. Whether that was them getting attention taken away from them at conventions that used to be purely for comics, which are now no longer just comic book conventions. They are comic books, there's movies, there's other vendors, there's cosplayers, there's panelists, I think there's, there's little bits of resentment here and there as time goes on. I think if you approach it with a little bit of empathy and the willingness to understand what people are going for, you'll have a little bit of an easier time. And I suppose on the cosplay side too, is like, trying to understand that, my extreme fandom for this sort of thing does not necessarily mean that somebody else is going to enjoy it the same way I do. And trying to understand that I don't necessarily need to recruit everybody who is interested in Star Wars into becoming a stormtrooper with me. Or that maybe, maybe that this small convention might not really be a good place for cosplayer or to bring a cosplayer to, because that audience might not be receptive of it. So I think it's all like just little bits like learning a little bit here, learning a little bit there, and hopefully everybody will sort of come around and sort of at least understand each other.
The evolution and the process, and really just all of the many things that come up. And of course, any chance I get to plug the book a little bit more, Cosplay History. Friends, there is so much to know, and you should read it. You should just go buy a copy, get a copy, read the book, enjoy it, just like you do your fandoms. So many cool things, and just a very excellent way of explaining all of it, Andrew. Thank you so much for being here. First of all, I do have one last question for you.
Sure.
And it really is something that just ticked me with all of the things that you do. You're working on cosplays. You have a lot of things going on, just in your regular life, and you've written a book which takes a lot of time. I've not attempted it yet, but I do. Just writing for the show takes forever. So I can only imagine how doing all the research and all the rewrites and everything that goes into this. Are there? I guess how do you balance everything? And find the time for all of your passions, for your passion for writing and your passion for cosplay. It seems like a lot to juggle.
Having a deadline, a contracted deadline, it really helps get words down. There's not really any magic there other than just like I have to turn in a manuscript of at least 75,000 words to my publisher on X date. And I actually ended up, I think I was supposed to do 75,000. I ended up doing about 100,000, just because at the end I was just adding on so much more. And one thing I'll point out is that this is Cosplay a history, not Cosplay the history. There are lots of places where I basically like to see this as a sort of a high level overview of the entire history. But there's certainly places where you can endlessly dive into more detail, like the 501st. There's lots more to that particular story. You can write entire books about the history of anime cosplay and Japanese cosplay on their own. You can write entire histories of science fiction fandom and the growth of cosplay. And I've got a whole library of books here with stuff about that. But I was hoping to sort of gather everything up into one, try to make as much sense of the whole thing as possible. Sort of just in a very readable way. So I how do I balance it all? There were lots of weekends where I had to travel. I had to leave my family. I took my family to some of these conventions, but there's lots of nights where hours where I would be spending interviewing folks, transcribe them, and then write up that chapter. And I mean, the helpful thing is I'm really loved writing it. I would say that if I didn't like this topic, it would be much harder to write about, but I found it to be really enjoyable just to learn as I was researching and as I was writing. And then, I think part of it is just making time for this stuff. So like I tried to get down a certain number of words per day in the book itself, but like in the same way that, I try to get out in troop with the 501st every, maybe not every couple of weeks, but every month, every other month or so, whenever we have events up here. We don't have them as much lately just because it's been, COVID and everything. But, there's weekends where I'll tell my family like, hey, I'm going to go up to this convention. On top of that, that's regular work and writing and reading and everything else that goes in. Just make time in little bits and pieces here and there where you can find it, I guess.
We are very thankful that you did. We appreciate all of the work and effort, blood, sweat, and tears, and everything else that went into creating this wonderful work, which will be on sale June 28th, ladies and gentlemen. And I guess, Andrew, where can we find you? Where can we buy your book? And how can we support you online?
So the book you can find at any bookstore. It's published through Simon & Schuster. And if you go to Simon Schuster's website and type in Cosplay History, you'll find the website for the product page for that book. It's a trade paperback. You can buy it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org, your local independent bookstore nearby. you can buy it as an ebook from various, wherever you buy your ebooks from, Apple, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Google, Kobo. And then as an audiobook, you can buy it from all the other usual retailers, Audible, Libro.fm, things like that. We just, as of the time we're talking right now, we just selected the narrator for the audiobook, and we've got a great woman doing it. And I can't wait to hear what she does with it.
Oh, perfect.
Where you can find me online, I'm on Twitter at Andrew Liptak, and I'm on Instagram. Actually, I can't even remember what my Instagram handle is. I think it's Liptak AA. I think that's it. Shows how much attention I've paid to the screen name. And the place that I spend most of my time on the internet, I've been trying to sort of pull back from social media quite a bit, just because of everything that goes on social media. I have a newsletter that I write called Transfer Orbit. It is transfer-orbit.ghost.io, and that's basically where I've sort of continued my science fiction journalism. I write about new books that are coming out. I try to write longer reviews of things like various TV shows that have come out, or commentary about stuff that's happening within the world of science fiction, fantasy, fandom. So you can sign up there. That goes out at least usually an issue once a week, but there's other subsets of supporting subscribers that I'll send out more stuff as I get it out, as I get it put together and put out. And I'll probably be putting some I think I've got a couple pieces that I didn't make the final cut for Cosplay History that I'll probably slip in there as sort of like a special feature, or some additional chapters on stuff that I didn't quite get to. I meant to write about furries. Didn't get around to doing that for this book. So that might be something I end up putting together. But also just ongoing commentary about cosplay or making or that sort of thing. That will end up there in the next, as it moves forward.
Please do follow and support Andrew Liptak where you can find him online, and of course purchase the book. We will have some notes for you in the show notes in the description so that you can click and purchase, and certainly support the official release. It is going to be a great launch. I wish you the best with everything that you're doing and coming out with, and I'm actually excited about the newsletter. I think I'm going to look that up after the show here and see if I can sign up for it. Just really exciting to have you as a guest. And again, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure, 100%. I've learned a lot just by talking to you, and yes, I would definitely hope that we see just more and more from you as time goes on. Thank you so much.
This is a book that I've been writing in some form since 2016, so it's been in my head for that many years, and it'll be great to get it out for everybody else to read and learn from it and hopefully enjoy it.
And with that, folks, this is Scotty B with the Heroes of Cosplay Sanctuary, and saying bye-bye.